Welcome to a tutorial video on Twine 2.0. In this video I'm going to go over saving and loading games in the Harlowe story format. So like many other libraries and frameworks and game engines, Twine gives developers the functionality to have players save and then load their games. So this can mean, depending on usage, the ability to record player statistics, remember names across sessions, or even set up a multiplayer system where the game or story is unique per user. So to do this, we use one of three macros, depending on what we do. We can either save a game, load a game, or check to see what saved games might already exist. So first thing we're going to do is to save a game. So within the Harlowe story format, to save a game means to tell the browser to remember all variables and their values. However, this does not extend to changer values. So something like setting the value of a variable red text to color red right here won't be saved. Neither will font or CSS macros or things like that. However, we can save numbers and strings and data maps and values like that. So to save, we can use the save game macro. By supplying it with some string, we can create the equivalent of files, and then later check to see if that name exists. For example, if we wanted to save to the slot AA, the output would look something like the following. And if we click Save Game to slot AA, it would save the game. I'm not going to do that quite yet, though. So to load a game, it works in a very similar manner. So if we already know that a save file exists because it was saved at some point in the past, we can use the load game macro, supply it with the same name, and then load anything that was saved. And see, we have an example here. But what if we wanted to know what saved games might already exist? So to check if a certain saved game exists before trying to load it, because obviously we can't load things that don't exist, we need to use the saved games macro. For example, that might look something like the following. The results of a call to the macro saved games is checked if it contains a certain entry, slot AA in this example. If it does, we load it, and that's this code right here. So in this case, and with saved games, the results are a data map, and we could check if something is within it using the contains keyword. So if the data map saved games contains slot AA, and then we load it. So let's go look at the code for just a second. So the very first thing I'm doing, although you haven't seen it in practice, is actually using the header tag on this passage here, welcome header, to check to see if saved games contains slot AA. If it does, then we know this is a return player. So let me show you that in action. I'm going to refresh the story, save game, save slot AA, load game. And so now it knows I'm a return player. Welcome back. And we saw this in practice with this welcome header passage. So using the header tag, which means this passage is run before any other passage loads, we check to see if saved games contain slot AA. If it does, then we know at some point in the past, i.e. I just did it a minute ago, is saved to sort of the file slot AA, and we know it's a return player. And in some other cases, we could do things like adjust statistics or adjust the story from there once we know it's a return player. So the start passage is pretty straightforward. I just have a link going out to saving a game. And saving a game uses a couple different combinations of things here. The first is the link macro. Because while you can have users just constantly saving the game, you usually want to do it once per passage. They click save the game, it saves, they move on. So I have a link macro right here to create a link to save game to slot A. Then I'm using the if macro to check if I can save in game to slot AA. Now the reason you want to do this is because sometimes, depending on browser settings, you won't be able to save. The player won't be able to save a game. So you need to double check that it's actually possible and then display some message with the else here that it couldn't happen. Now reasons this may not happen is because the browser may be set up to be in privacy mode or be out of memory or some other sort of weird things that can happen. So you always want to warn the player like, hey, you tried to save but something didn't quite work out, and so they get some type of message here. So always, if you're going to save, connect it with some type of if-else set of conditionals here. We'll check to see if it works. If it doesn't, warn the player. So let's look at loading a game now. So loading a game works a similar way to saving a game, as I explained at the beginning of this video. We have a link, and then we use the load game and we supply it with the same name. Now, of course, this could be a variable here. If you decide you want your players putting their name in at the beginning or giving some name to this story, they could saving and loading from that title each time, and then you can change it as they change things. For example, if you wanted them to branch to different parts depending on how they saved or depending on how they loaded, you could do that as well. Now, checking for save games is the same as I showed in the video. It's also the same as the welcome header. So if saved games contains something, some name, if it does, then we load it. If it doesn't, we just ignore it because we don't care. So in practice, you saw that I saved to slot AA, and then it ran the header and it knew I was return player. Now what if I wanted to load that in practice? If I click load, it puts me back at wherever I saved. In this case, it was at the save a game passage, and it sort of rewinds, but places me wherever it was with whatever values were saved at that point. So it knows I'm a return player, and it put me right back to that passage I was at. And then if I want to, I can save again, but it doesn't really do anything in this case, since the save will be the same. But in this way, you can have players progress through a session, play as long as they like, maybe an hour, maybe 10 minutes. Maybe they don't have a lot of time, so only a couple of minutes. They can save, they can close that tab or close the browser, come back and play again with saving and reloading using different names. And then again, you can set these to variables. So if you want the player to have the name, or if you want people who log in on the same computer, for example, to have different names, they could do that as well. And so it all sort of depends on what you want to name things. But again, you want to check to see if it exists. Maybe at first, maybe it's part of a header, maybe at the very beginning of a story. Check to see if it exists. If it does, load some stuff, make some changes. And then throughout the story, or at certain maybe points that choices diverge, you could have them save using some string, and in this case slot AA, and then load that game with, again, the same name, slot AA. And of course, checking to see if it actually exists. If it exists, load it, move on. But in this way, we can actually save variables between sessions. However, remember, it's not saving across browsers. It's also not saving if browser histories are cleared or if the domain name changes. So for example, I'm saving right here because I'm using the twinery.org URL, and these are live as I'm creating them in the online editor. However, if I move this to the desktop version, it would then save to the desktop. It wouldn't save to online. But that sort of makes sense in practice, of course. So as you're using programs, they save to wherever they are, and when you move the program, it saves to something different. So something to keep in mind, that as long as the file is somewhere, for example, if you're hosting it on some site, then all those save files will be linked to that name. And so a player can keep playing as long as they play to that version. But as soon as they move to a different place, a different domain name, for example, the file names would change and the browser might get confused, and the file names, of course, wouldn't be the same. But here's a great way using the save game, the load game, and the saved games macro to create some dynamic things that extend outside of a single session within Twine and allow you to save things or create multiplayer sessions or sort of whatever you want to do to create different save files, load those files, or do different things with those files depending on how you want to create your story or game. Thanks for watching.